Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to the Thompson Room for the second of 3 Huggins lectures by Dr. Ryan Hanley, who comes to us from the University of Exeter in England. A bit more on him in a moment. Today's lecture is hybrid, so we'll take questions both in person and from our Zoom audience. If you're in the Thompson Room today, just raise your hand. If you're in the Zoom audience, use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to navigate those 2 different platforms. Ryan Hanley is lecturer in modern British history at the University of Exeter, UK. His work explores the contributions of people of African descent to political, social, and cultural life in 18th and 19th century Britain. Oh, thank you. Including but extending well beyond the questions of slavery and abolition. His first monograph, Beyond Slavery and Abolition, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And with Katie Donington and Jessica Moody, he co-edited Britain's History and Memory of Transatlantic Slavery in 2016. He's also published widely in a number of top journals, including Slavery and Abolition and the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society. Hanley is the only historian ever to win both the Alexander Prize for Best First Article on British History in 2016 and the Whitfield Prize for Best First Monograph on British History in 2019, both awarded by the Royal Historical Society. If you're interested in the full and understudied sweep of Black British history, as I am, I would urge you to use as a starting point a post by Dr. Hanley in Exeter's Imperial and Global Forum on new books on Black British history. This is just a recounting of 6 very important books that were published, I think in 2019 or 2018. But as he says there, this field of scholarship is changing the way we think about Britain's past and its relationship to global and imperial history. The fact that these lectures are being delivered on the same day that Harvard has released its own massive and often jarring and very upsetting report on the history and legacy of slavery at this university, I think we will all agree that this type of reframing is critical to our moving forward. Today, Dr. Hanley will speak with us about the racialized concepts of legitimacy and illegitimacy, as you can see up there, through the lens of Robert Wedderburn's story. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Hanley to the Hutchins Center and to Harvard today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, legitimacy and illegitimacy and inheritance too, I want to talk about today. I'm going to begin then with a couple of quotes. The first was from Robert Wedderburn in The Axle to the Root in 1817. Oh, my father, what do you deserve at my hands? Your crimes will be visited upon your legitimate offspring, for the sins of a wicked father will be visited upon his children who continue the practice of their father's crimes. Ought I not encourage your slaves, O my brother, to demand their freedom, even at the danger of your life, if it could not be obtained without? And my second quote to start us off is from Wedderburn's fellow British radical, William Hazlitt. Fine word, legitimate. We wonder where our English politicians picked it up. Is it an echo from the tomb of the martyred monarch, Charles I? Or was it the last word which his son, James II, left behind him in his flight and bequeathed with his abdication to his legitimate successors? Is it not written in our annals in the years 1688, in 1715, or 1745? It was not Sterling then, which was only 15 years before his present Majesty's accession to the throne. Has it become so since? Family legend has it that Sir John Wedderburn, 5th Baronet of Blackness, didn't even stop his game of backgammon when he heard he was to be hanged for treason the next morning. The head of an impoverished branch of an ancient Scottish clan, Sir John had been, a staunch supporter of the Jacobite cause in 1745. He was almost bound by tradition to support the claim of Charles Edward Stuart to reclaim Britain's throne for the Stuart dynasty. The Wedderburns had always been Jacobites. Indeed, the reason this branch of the clan were impoverished in the first place was because Sir John's father, Alexander, had been deposed from his position of Clerk of Dundee in 1717, punishment for his support for the Old Pretender during the last Jacobite uprising back in 1715. Before that, the Wedderburns had played their part opposing the Williamite forces in 1689. The family had bound their fortunes implacably to a cause, and that had defined them as rebels and insurrectionaries for more than 50 years, with each generation losing more than the last as punishment. In that time, dispossession had done its work. Sir John grew up with a sense of indignant frustration at his diminished prospects in the world. It was all but inevitable that he and his eldest son, also named John, would rally to Bonnie Prince Charlie's banner at the Battle of Culloden in April 1746. After the Jacobite cause was finally crushed for good at that battle, Sir John and his son got separated. The father was captured and marched down to London. The son fled to Jamaica. They say that Sir John's second son, James Wedderburn, rode down to be with his father for his last night and helped him to set his affairs in order. After he'd finished his game of backgammon, Sir John got down to writing his final letters with James's help. To Frederick, the Prince of Wales, and father to the future King George III, Sir John was humble and conciliatory. I have a wife and 9 children in a very miserable condition as to subsistence. I've given strict injunctions to my wife to educate our children, being 5 sons and 4 daughters, in the strictest principles to your R.H.'s family. If your R.H. pleases to honor them with your protection in consideration of my sufferings, whose last moments shall be spent in praying for the prosperity of your family. Now, this was sheer pragmatism. No more than a few hours earlier, he'd written to his wife for the last time, noting that there is one thing I'll recommend to you, though I believe it's needless, that is to instill into my children, male and female, a just sense of what our country has suffered in general, and I in particular. The next day, the young James Wedderburn, then 15 years old, watched as his father was hanged until dead, then his head removed and his body cut into pieces. Of course, it traumatized him terribly. He went on to join his elder brother to try to revive the family's fortunes in Jamaica, but many decades later, whenever business brought him back to London, he would travel miles out of his way to avoid going near Kennington Common, where the execution took place, and the tower where Sir John had been held. And just as Sir John had wished, wherever they went in the world, his legitimate children never forgot what he had suffered for his rebellion. Now, long after young James had fled to Jamaica and grown wealthy from the slavery economy there, his illegitimate son, Robert Wedderburn, came to Britain, Sir John's grandson, off the back of a short stint in the Royal Navy. He too remembered his grandfather's grisly fate. Robert admired Sir John, describing him as a staunch Jacobite who, quote, exerted himself strenuously in the cause of the Pretender, aiding to restore the exiled family to the throne of England. He recalled, perhaps a little disingenuously, that, quote, when I first came to England in the year 1779, I remembered seeing the remains of a rebel's skull which had been affixed over Temple Bar, but I never yet could fully ascertain whether it was my dear grandfather's or not. Robert appreciated Sir John's rebelliousness, and perhaps he even shared with his father the sense that he had been martyred to his principles. But unlike his slave-owning father and brothers, Robert himself was not welcome as a part of the family story. This is literally true. The huge 2-volume family history, the Wedderburn book, compiled by Alexander Wedderburn and printed by private subscription for the family in 1898, listed Robert Wedderburn, the Black Preacher, under a section titled Persons Named Wedderburn, but not shown to be connected to the family. As we have seen, his attempt to rewrite the family history was not an affectionate gesture. Robert mentioned Sir John's part in 1745 and the painful memory of his execution, partly to needle his half-brother Andrew Colville during a public quarrel between them, which broke out in March 1824. But an equally important reason to bring this up was for Robert to situate himself as a born rebel, the inheritor of a pedigree of insurrection stretching back for generations. Today, I want to think about the vexed notions of inheritance and legitimacy and how they affected Wedderburn as his insurrectionary political outlook developed during his ascendancy in the British ultra-radical movement. The 18th century is known by some British demographers and family historians as the century of illegitimacy, due to the unprecedented upsurge in illegitimate children observable in every major British city and town after 1750. More so than ever before, British society was teeming with the products of premarital and extramarital sexual relationships. As ever, there's a colonial dimension to this picture. As we saw yesterday, planters like James Wedderburn and Thomas Thistlewood were shameless in their sexual exploitation of the enslaved women over whom they asserted the rights of legal ownership. We might assume that the mixed race products of these sexual encounters would have little to expect from their white fathers, and in most cases, this was probably true. But as Daniel Livesey's recent work has shown, many Jamaican planters did in fact recognize their illegitimate offspring and incorporated them, albeit in complex and often incomplete ways, into their transatlantic family networks. Some illegitimate planters' children, such as Henry Redhead York, the son of a formerly enslaved woman named Sarah Bullock and a colonial administrator named Henry Redhead, were not only recognized by their fathers, but brought home to Britain and expensively educated, set up, in other words, to become gentlemen. This is one aspect of a broader trend, much parodied in British novels and plays of the period, of planters' insatiable desire for upward social mobility, their leveraging of slavery-derived wealth into political influence and family prestige within Britain's rigid class hierarchy. Some mixed-race children enjoyed privileged lives in Britain, and some returned to the West Indies to carry on the family business in the slavery economy. Many others, including Wedderburn and several of his radical social circle in London, were not so lucky. The experience of disappointed expectations and the disconnection of blood from kinship ties profoundly influenced Wedderburn's political outlook. He was not alone. The radical world which he helped to build in London during the 1810s was filled with the bastard scions of wealthy fathers who had forgotten about them. Little wonder then that it was also the crucible for a host of new ways of thinking about the social inequalities activated by the inheritance of capital and the effects of this on the political legitimacy of the nation's rulers and lawmakers. The plebeian political movements of this period were intellectually diverse, but they were united at least in questioning the legitimacy of a corrupt and failing political class and networks of power that boiled down ultimately to inherited privilege. The arrogant conflation of class background with differential claims to political legitimacy, moreover, inspired many artisan and ultra-radicals like Wedderburn to question the validity of legitimacy itself as a basis for social organization. Slavery was one of the most common ways radicals described the condition of the majority of the British population with no legitimate, i.e. inherited claim to political representation. The progressive infiltration of both Creole and absentee slave owners into the British aristocracy during the early 19th century, and their almost universally conservative, loyalist political alignment, were seen by many radicals as evidence of the essentially corrupted legitimacy claimed by the British establishment as a whole. For example, when Edward Lascelles, the slave-owning Earl of Harewood, gave a speech at a loyalist dinner in April 1818, he decried the radical press as reducing ordinary Britain's ability to become better political subjects. Radical journalist William Hone responded with scorn, claiming that these sentiments were, quote, worthy of a trafficker in blood. They are the legitimate growth of a West India climate and may be pursued with impunity on a plantation of slaves. But we still hope there remains amongst us sufficient public spirit to resist their adoption in this country. As James Ford has explored, The Haitian Revolution, in opening up the previously unthinkable and perhaps in Michel Rolfe-Trio's sense, remained unthinkable for many years afterwards, but opening up the previously unthinkable concept of a government run by those who had been enslaved played a crucial part in the way that both plebeian and elite political thinkers in Britain rethought concepts of political legitimacy during this period. And as we will see, Wedderburn was most certainly influenced in his political thought by what happened in Haiti. Now, when he first made the decision to come to Britain in November of 1778, Wedderburn's family had been in the news recently. His uncle John, son of Sir John, 5th Baronet of Blackness. So his uncle John, who had returned to re-establish the family's fortunes in Scotland in 1769, had recently lost a high-profile court case against one of his slaves, Joseph Knight. Knight had come to Britain with John Wedderburn as his domestic servant, but he'd fallen in love with one of the other servants in the household, and the two had left service together to start a family. John Wedderburn was furious and tried to arrest Knight and have him sent back to the family's estates in Jamaica. Knight sued for his freedom, and eventually the case came to court with a ruling delivered in 1778. Knight v. Wedderburn, as it's now known by historians, essentially confirmed in Scots law the precedent set 6 years earlier in England by Lord Chief Justice Mansfield in the much more famous Somerset case. So, after Knight v. Wedderburn, slavery was still technically legal in Scotland, but slaveholders were now explicitly prohibited from arresting slaves who chose to leave their service, and they could therefore no longer force them to return to the West Indies. The case then was widely celebrated as the de facto outlawing of slavery in Scotland. Interestingly, Joseph Knight was working as a serving boy at John Wedderburn's Blue Castle estate in Westmoreland, Jamaica, at the same time that Robert's mother, Rosanna, then pregnant with him, sought asylum there in the early 1760s. So Joseph Knight, who's a hugely significant individual for essentially outlawing slavery in Scotland, was potentially very likely came into contact as a child with Robert Wedderburn's mother. So it's a kind of a coincidence of kind of an interesting coincidence of history, really. Perhaps this legal confirmation was reassuring for Robert. Although he'd been free since he was a very young child, he was always paranoid about being enslaved or falsely imprisoned during his time in Jamaica. As he put it, such is their hatred of anyone having black blood in his veins and who dares to think and act as a free man, they would most certainly have trumped up some charge against me and hung me. Now, after he witnessed Talkee Amy being flogged around 1775 under suspicion of Obeah, he traveled around the island, taking on odd jobs as a millwright, spending time in both Port Royal and Spanish Town, but never spending too long in one place. When he enlisted in the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman aboard the HMS Nabob in November 1778, he did so either off the books or under a false name. When he arrived in London early in 1779, he tried to move on from the trauma of his childhood, but the city was an unforgiving place. And as we'll see tomorrow, he teetered always on the precipice of destitution. When the post-war economic recession began to bite in the mid-1780s and his family were on the brink of starvation, he decided as a last resort to head up to his father's new country estate in Scotland to seek assistance. Inveresk Lodge is a beautiful building set in acres of picturesque and carefully manicured gardens. Its relatively modest size, particularly in comparison to the vast palaces built by other British slaveholders, reflects James Wedderburn's fairly modest fortune. John was the one who'd received their father's inheritance when the attainder was lifted from the family in the late 1760s. James managed to regain his respectable footing in Scottish high society through other means. He partly funded his respectable lifestyle through the money he'd made in Jamaica, but most of it had come from his wife, Isabella Blackburn Colville. Indeed, clawing his way back up the social ladder had come at the cost of James Wedderburn's name, which he agreed to change to Wedderburn Colville for inheritance purposes. His legitimate heirs, incidentally, had to drop the Wedderburn name if they wished to inherit a share of their mother's family's considerable wealth. Ironically then, James's rowdy, illegitimate, so-called mulatto son was therefore able to retain the name of the ancient clan, while the inheritor of the estates was not. For Robert, though, approaching Inveresk Lodge after an exhausting 350-mile stagecoach journey from London must have been a bitter reminder that he was owed much more than merely a name. When he was in his 60s, he reflected on their meeting that day, only their second after Talkee Amy had called James a mean Scotch rascal in Jamaica some 10 years earlier. Even in 1824, Robert's rage was still palpable. I visited my father, who had the inhumanity to threaten to send me to jail if I troubled him. Nor did he deny me to be his son, but called me a lazy fellow and said that he would do nothing for me. To add insult to injury, Robert would have had to have left the back way via the kitchen, where James's footman gave him a draught of weak beer and a cracked sixpence to set him up for the 350-mile journey back down to London. Obviously, it wasn't enough, and Robert had to apply to the city council at Edinburgh for a traveller's pass so he didn't get picked up as a vagrant along the way. Could Robert reasonably have expected any more than this from his father, despite his obviously and visibly illegitimate status? In some senses, yes, maybe he could. It was common among Scottish planters in Wedderburn's circle to send their children back to the imperial metropolis to be educated, and Robert claimed that his father, James, had transported two more of his illegitimate mulatto children, born by Esther Trotter, to Inveresk, and that they'd grown up alongside Andrew. When he sought out his father at Inveresk, Robert's expectations were far more modest. He merely sought a small measure of assistance when he hit dire straits. But he'd been dispossessed, both literally and figuratively, by the terms of his manumission in 1765. James no longer bore any goodwill towards him, let alone any sense of parental obligation. When Robert returned empty-handed to London, matters did not improve quickly for his family. Around 1791, with his wife heavily pregnant and unable to work, and the cost of bread on the rise, Wedderburn tried again to obtain some familial support, this time from his brother Andrew Colville, who was based much closer to home in London. Andrew wouldn't even acknowledge that they were related. Wedderburn was left to dig himself and his family out of poverty alone, setting up a modest tailoring business and inching slowly towards a period of financial stability. Once he'd finally managed to keep the wolves from the door, Wedderburn embarked on a new venture, writing. His first published piece, Truth Self-Supported, or a refutation of certain doctrinal errors generally adopted in the Christian Church, appeared around about 1800. This text was at heart a vindication of his idiosyncratic and staunchly anti-authoritarian religious views. Here he outlined for the first time a foundational hermeneutic that was to inflect his secular politics as much as his troubled relationship with God and the established church. So this is from Wedderburn's first published tract, Truth Self-Supported. He said it's written in third person. He then thought it his privilege and duty to admit of no doctrine, however plausible, but what he perceived in his own judgment was clearly and evidently contained in the Holy Scriptures. Confident that God had sealed him unto the day of redemption, not only sealed, but removed him by his power from a legal state of mind into a state of gospel liberty, that is to say, a deliverance from the power or authority of the law, considering himself not to be under the power of the law, but under grace. The essence of Wedderburn's theological position then was that personal morality should never be mediated by a person who claimed any kind of personal authority or legal authority over anyone else. This was on one level an evangelical call for believers to abandon the very notion of a traditional hierarchical church. On another, it was the moral foundation for his lifelong disdain for authority in general. Wedderburn's nominally theological position then clearly had a secular analogue, but in some respects his ongoing poverty and willful lack of respectability kept him at the fringes of largely quite genteel reformist movements that had survived the repressive purges of the mid-1790s. Indeed, despite his anti-establishment credentials, he did not show much interest in British politics until he met the land reformer and ultra-radical Thomas Spence in 1814. As Ian McCalman's shown, Spence's political philosophy and vision for a utopian future could hardly be better suited to a man of Wedderburn's background and outlook. At the core of Spence's political ideology was the idea that all land should be held in common as a people's farm, and crucially, that all forms of inheritance should be abolished. The Spencian plan, as Wedderburn and his fellow Spencian philanthropists called it, was a vision of agrarian communitarianism, which they argued could only be achieved through popular rebellion, insurrection, and ultimately revolution. As part of their outlook, Spencians took special aim at the concept of legitimacy as a mechanism designed to oppress the poor and dispossessed. As Spence himself put it in 1803, when the revolution came, the common land, quote, shall be deemed the equal property of man, woman, and child, whether old or young, rich or poor, legitimate or illegitimate. There was another reason that Wedderburn was drawn to Spence, though. Unlike most reformists of the period, Spence retained the universalism and the cosmopolitan outlook that had characterized the earlier radical movements of the early 1790s, the kind of Enlightenment philosophy universalist tradition. And as Ajmal O'Keefe has explored in detail, the Spencian plan explicitly encompassed colonial contexts. Moreover, his language equated dispossession from land and the allocation of illegitimate personal and political status explicitly with colonial slavery. The responding in 1803 to the hypothetical objection to his plan that it was no crime to invest in the land, Spence stated it was never supposed a crime while the present system continues, but it would certainly be a crime to oppose the extinction of such nefarious traffic. For, like the slave trade, it is fraught with every mischief and evil to the human race. And the same arguments will serve to defend the one kind of traffic, the buying and selling of land privately and keeping it from the people, as the other, the transatlantic slave trade. This was the message that Wedderburn took most closely to heart. For him, Spence's scheme clarified the confluence of forces that had both delegitimized his personal claims for support and recognition and literally enslaved half his family. It also helped him to shape his own vision for a transatlantic insurrectionary radicalism based on fundamentally on reclaiming the land for the people. He'd seen during his time living with Talkee Amy how control over the production of food on commonly owned land could empower those dismissed as possessing no legal personhood. And as Katie Castellano has recently suggested, Spencianism gave Wedderburn a language to frame his own knowledge of how the provision grounds in Jamaica were, quote, creatively appropriated by African people and turned into a commons where shared property, time, and resources formed resistance to the practices and subjectivities inculcated by the violent exploitation of the plantation system. While Spence had been supportive of the idea of the enslaved in the West Indies could use common land ownership, I should say, to press for their freedom, he was fuzzy on the details because he'd never been there. Wedderburn, on the other hand, could be specific. He dedicated himself to the Spencian philanthropists, and after Spence's death in September 1814, he rose to a position of considerable prominence within the group. In a series of articles published in 1817, in two radical periodicals, The Forlorn Hope and The Axe Laid to the Root, and likely inspired by news of the recent insurrection of the enslaved in Barbados in 1816, Wedderburn laid out his plan for a new Spencian utopia and how it might actually work following a successful revolution led by the enslaved in his home colony of Jamaica. In an article addressed to his fellow countrymen, the enslaved of Jamaica, whom he hoped would establish this new republic, he warned them above all else to avoid the mistakes that had allowed venality and corruption to creep into the British system and delegitimize rule. There, Wedderburn claimed Governors and landlords exercised arbitrary sway over truth and falsehood through the allocation of legitimacy to some claims and the withholding of legitimacy from others. His own experiences of dispossession and delegitimization again appeared to resurface here when he said, they can make bastards lawful, they can dissolve marriages, they punish in this country for stealing of children through, though the thief be rich, and intends the child to inherit his estates. And at the same time, they make it right that hundreds of thousands of Africans may be stolen and sold like cattle in the market. The ambiguities of British legal system, he said, had made it into a foolish game, which only served to keep the sons of the great in employment as lawyers. And this game, he said, will always be carried on while the great manage the law, and the younger son is deprived of a share of his father's estate. Abolishing private inheritance was Wedderburn's preferred solution, of course. He went on to promote a system of republican government to the enslaved based on the Spencian plan, suggesting universal suffrage, annual parliaments, and of course, the abolition of all private land ownership. The abolition of slavery was, of course, taken for granted in this plan, as it was a republic led by the formerly enslaved. There was also a healthy dose of militarism here. All women and men, he suggested, should be trained in the arts of war, since there was no way the British state would ever let them live in peace once they'd wrested their freedom from the planters. Saint-Domingue, he said, had shown them that much. In some respects, Wedderburn was restricted in how far he could go in printed pamphlets by the increasingly draconian anti-radical stance being then adopted by the Home Office. And the Spencian philanthropists were increasingly in the crosshairs. Even as he was outlining his post-revolutionary Jamaican Republic in 1817, Wedderburn saw his friend and associate Thomas Evans arrested on suspicion of high treason. Suddenly, committing one's plans for revolution to paper, even hypothetically, seemed like a rather bad idea. The Home Office sent spies and agents provocateurs into ultra-radical groups, eagerly feeding them just enough rope to hang themselves with. This helped to create a sense of paranoia within the Spencian philanthropists and accentuated some of the philosophical differences among the members. On the one side were conspiratorial insurrectionists like Arthur Thistlewood and William Davidson, who preferred to operate in secret, setting up armed cells, performing military drills, and communicating in ciphers. On the other, men like Wedderburn and Evans were keen to promote a robust, open, plebeian debating culture where revolutionary ideas could be shared among like-minded radicals at gatherings in tumbling down haylofts and the upstairs rooms of dodgy pubs. I've included this, I think it's George Cruikshank's caricature of a peep inside one of these ultra-radical debating taverns, because Wedderburn supposedly is being depicted here on the right-hand side, although it's obviously a hugely kind of racist depiction of him, but it demonstrates that Wedderburn on the right there is sort of seen as central to these ultra-radical movements. And incidentally, to Wedderburn's extreme right is Arthur Thistlewood, who you can tell by his mutton chops there. So you can see there's Arthur Thistlewood. Wedderburn next to him. With this ideal in mind, Wedderburn rejoined forces with Evans after he got out of jail in 1818, and they rented out a room for holding public debates at number 6 Archer Street in Soho. But Evans was clearly shaken up by this narrow escape from a capital charge, and Wedderburn felt that he'd lost his nerve. The two had a rather spectacular falling out in April 1819. Wedderburn wanted to set up his own debating house in Hopkins Street, Soho, where he could speak as violently against the government as he wanted. He comprehensively burned his bridges with Evans by helping himself to all the furniture from their Archer Street debating hall. Evans heard about this and sent 3 heavies to accost him in the street while he was in the process of moving the furniture. They even broke down the door of Wedderburn's home and took back one of the chairs despite the protestations of his wife, Mary. Wedderburn, never one to shrink from a fight, shortly afterwards published his side of the affair in 2 separate broadsides in which he distributed about the neighborhood and posted up on shop windows, attacking Evans as, quote, an apostate and also a double-faced politician. He even insulted his wife as being brandy-faced. Obviously, this marked the end of this short-lived partnership with Evans. At least these publications, though, gave him a chance to advertise his new debating room at Hopkins Street. Freed from the comparatively moderating influence of Evans, Wedderburn's new chapel hosted some of the most incendiary and outright seditious debates of the entire radical movement in early 19th century Britain. Naturally, the audience was teeming with government spies, and that's how we know what they said in there. One informer gives a sense of what kind of place it was when he said that, quote, both orators and audience were, with a few exceptions, persons of the very lowest description. Wedderburn spoke very violently. Indeed, some of his expressions appear to have shocked even the worst of their hearers. But Wedderburn managed to protect himself from being picked up for sedition or indeed treason in 2 important ways. Firstly, he'd had himself ordained as a Unitarian minister so that he could more believably claim that the debates were of a religious character. And secondly, he framed many of these debates not only around the extremely touchy subject of domestic politics, but around the question of colonial slavery. On the 9th of August, 1819, for example, so this is 7 days before, this is 1 week before the Peterloo massacre, which is seen as kind of high watermark of British radicalism in this period. So on the 9th of August, 1819, Wedderburn, advertising himself as, quote, the offspring of an African slave, opened a debate on the question, can it be murder to kill a tyrant? Has a slave an inherent right to slay his master who refuses him his liberty? One observer, the notably obsequious Reverend Chetwode Eustace, was unconvinced and wrote to Lord Sidmouth the next day, saying, yesterday evening I proceeded to Hopkins Street Chapel to hear the question discussed whether it be right for the people of England to assassinate their rulers. For this, my lord, I conceive to be the real purport of the question, though proposed in other terms. He may have been underestimating Wedderburn's commitment to revolution in the West Indies, and indeed the ongoing personal connections he claimed with family and friends there. Wedderburn had, in fact, spoken very explicitly about the British state's complicity in transatlantic slavery, though, as ever, he saw it as one part of the larger problem of labor exploitation in an increasingly globalized economy built on the exploitation of the powerless. Another spy reported that Wedderburn rose and said, the government was necessitated to send men in arms to the West Indies or Africa, which produced commotion. They would employ blacks to go and steal females. This was done by parliament men who'd done it for gain, the same as they employed them in their cotton factories to make slaves of them. Another spy present on the night, 3rd, claimed that Wedderburn had said that, quote, every king, bishop, priest, and potentate ought to be put to death for failing to protect the poor and the enslaved, and even that, quote, the Prince Regent ought to be put to death for failing to enforce the law of scripture regarding slavery. Equally worrying for the Home Office was that Wedderburn had said, half seriously, that he'd be happy to incite another insurrection of the enslaved in Jamaica. When the sense of the meeting was taken, almost all the crowd voted in favor of the proposition, with several members of the audience proclaiming themselves ready to go to the West Indies and assist in the enslaved's revolution. Apparently, at this, Wedderburn leaned back in his chair and exclaimed, I can now write home and tell the slaves to murder their masters as soon as they please. Given his extraordinary fearlessness in speech, it's little wonder then that Wedderburn eventually ended up in prison. What is perhaps more surprising was the fact that he was eventually prosecuted on a seditious blasphemy charge rather than for outright politically seditious speech. In truth, Wedderburn's enthusiasm for transatlantic insurrection synergized well with the anti-clerical position that he'd outlined many years before in The Truth Self-Supported. This was influenced by his increasing alienation from mainstream religious institutions amid growing anger toward church authorities, who he saw as actively propping up the plantocracy through the Church Missionary Society and the Methodist missions in the West Indies. Increasingly, Wedderburn appears to have given up on God altogether. One Home Office informant reported in November 1817 that he was, quote, a very active member of the Polemics, a debating society that the spy thought were engaged in, quoting, quote, promulgating atheism. He noted that on one occasion, Wedderburn, quote, boldly asserted that there was no deity or future state. At the end of this speech, Wedderburn sold or distributed seditious pamphlets of the spy, which most likely were copies of the Acts laid to the root. His extemporized public speeches on this issue were even more inflammatory because they assaulted Christian institutions, even non-conforming connections like Wesleyan Methodism, as outgrowths of a corrupt state that was complicit with slavery both at home and abroad. On the 8th of November, 1819, for example, he hosted a debate on the rather leading question, is a church establishment necessary for the preservation of religion, morality, and good order, or is it merely a political institution and a tyrannical imposition on the people with a view to more easily enslave them? Neither was this mention of enslaving the British poor merely a kind of superficial, useful resonance for Wedderburn. The following Wednesday, the 10th of November, 1819, he proposed a follow-up debate, this time tackling the connections between Christian authority and slavery in the West Indies head-on. The question on that occasion was, you can't read that, I'll read that, which is the greater crime for the Wesleyan missionaries to preach up passive obedience to the poor black slaves in the West Indies, or to extort from them at the rate of £18,000 per annum under pretense of supporting the gospel? On that night, he stood up and expressed his hope that, quote, they might expose the villainy of our church and state by sending out those vipers of church missionaries to suck the blood of the poor, innocent blacks in the West Indies and to make them believe the great God was with them. But instead of God, it was the devil. And the missionaries that was sent from London by the Secretary of State for the Home Department, and for no other motives than to extort money for the great. And who is this owing to? Why, to the great heads of this nation who are robbing the poor every day by loading them with heavy burdens, such as taxation, extravagance, and luxury. We experience more and more every day, but we must put a stop to them and have a fresh set in their place. And then there will be some good done, but not until then. So it's easy to see why this type of speech set alarm bells ringing at the Home Office. In truth, they were by this point already preparing to bring Wedderburn in. As we've seen, the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, had been keeping tabs on Wedderburn for some time, even querying the Solicitor General to see if he could prosecute him following the debate about slaves killing their masters back in early August, when he'd suggested that the Prince Regent ought to be put to death. The final straw came when Wedderburn referred to Jesus Christ as a radical reformer during a debate in the end of October. Once again, he questioned the legitimacy of both priestly authority and paternal authority as a means of criticizing the government. Jesus Christ, he said, says, acknowledge no rabbi, no priest. No, he knew their tricks, and he says, stand it no longer. Jesus Christ says, acknowledge no fathers. Why? Because fathers at these days were allowed to thrash their sons at any age. And finally, Wedderburn uttered outright blasphemy at the same instant as publicly declaring his intention to take up arms against the government. They tell us to be quiet like that bloody spoony Jesus Christ, who like a bloody fool tells us when we get a slap on one side of the face, turn gently round and ask them to smack the other. But I, like jolly old Peter, give me a rusty sword, for they have declared war against the people. Multiple spies had heard this and immediately reported it. Wedderburn was arrested shortly after the debates about the Methodist missionaries in November 1819. After a quick trial in February 1820, he was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in Dorchester jail. As McCalman, Michael Morris, and others have noted, getting arrested at this time may have saved Wedderburn's life. One of his fellow speakers at the missionaries debate in October, William Davidson, was not so lucky. Davidson, along with 4 other Spencians from Wedderburn's extended circle, was tried and executed for a failed attempt to assassinate the Prime Minister and kick off a full-blown revolution in England in February 1820, an event that came to be known as the Cato Street conspiracy. According to McCalman, Wedderburn was a key part of the plan and would, quote, almost certainly have been picked up alongside them if he wasn't already in jail awaiting sentencing on the blasphemy charge. Davidson and Wedderburn, the 2 most prominent Black radicals in London, had a lot in common. Both had been born and raised exposed to the full horrors of colonial slavery in Jamaica. Both, in fact, were illegitimate mixed-race sons of white slave-holding Scottish fathers and Black Jamaican-born mothers. Both had been disappointed, though, to different degrees in their expectations of parental support and acknowledgement from their white fathers, which had contributed to both of them encountering terrible hardships on the streets of early 19th century London. And both had arrived at a particularly severe and radical insurrectionist political position, with Davidson reportedly acting as the master at arms for the Cato Street conspirators, supplying them and the other insurrectionary cells with weapons. Neither were these the only two illegitimate children of slaveholding families entangled in this failed coup attempt. The leader of the Cato Street conspiracy, Arthur Thistlewood, was white, but he was the illegitimate son of William Thistlewood, who was the nephew of the Jamaican planter Thomas Thistlewood. Now, while Arthur never met his great uncle, he too had witnessed slavery up close during his service in the West Indies as a commissioned officer in the Royal Navy in 1793 to 1794, probably as part of the expeditionary force sent to claim Saint-Domingue for the British during the Revolution. According to the patchy and unreliable sources that we have for Arthur Thistlewood's early life, he quit his commission shortly after arriving in the West Indies and escaped to the United States. After a spell in France, he, like Davidson and Wedderburn, fell into poverty and became increasingly convinced that magistrates, priests, and high-born gentlemen had no legitimacy, no right to withhold his birthright of political freedom. We began this lecture with an execution for treason, so it's appropriate, I think, that we end with one. On the 20th of March, 1820, Thistlewood and Davidson were hanged for their part in the conspiracy, along with their co-conspirators Thomas Ings, Richard Tidd, and John Thomas Brunt. Once dead, their heads were then removed by a surgeon's knife and held aloft to the crowd. This is the latest example of a person being beheaded for treason in England that I've been able to find. I think that Davidson may have been one of the 5 last people to be beheaded for treason in England. Not long after this, it came to light that the Cato Street conspiracy had actually been doomed to fail from the start. Much of the plan had been concocted by a government agent provocateur named George Edwards, who had infiltrated the group at an early stage and railroaded the others into ever more desperate measures, just for the purposes of securing their capture and conviction. The deaths of these 5 men was deemed a fair price to pay to put a stop to the insurrectionary activities of the Spencian philanthropists. Degraded by poverty and insulted by the very people who professed to protect them, Wedderburn, Davidson, and Thistlewood all rejected the legitimacy of the government and to some extent the very notion of legitimacy itself. The notion of hereditary privilege operating along the lines of legitimate heirs from which they had all been excluded was a big part of this. Another of Wedderburn's invited speakers at the Hopkins Street Chapel, Alan Davenport, lampooned the absurdity of being ruled by hereditary right in his banned 1819 play, The Kings, or Legitimacy Unmasked, which he claimed the Spencians often liked to act out together during their meetings. In this play, Davenport reasoned that since all monarchs ultimately derived their kingly legitimacy from, quote, ruffian force and venal sin, then they would naturally try to, quote, rule free men by laws decreed for slaves. What could men like Thistlewood, Davidson, and Wedderburn, locked out of any democratic means for redress, do about this situation? They took matters into their own hands. All three of them began merely by writing plans and giving speeches. In the tense atmosphere of the late 1810s, and especially so after the infamous Peterloo massacre in Manchester on the 16th of August, 1819, this on its own was enough to paint a target on each of their backs. The Home Office acted swiftly and without mercy against them. Thistlewood and Davidson especially were cruelly deceived and eventually paid for their desperate actions with their lives. When these two idealistic men mounted the scaffold in March 1820, did they realize that their plan to mount a revolution in England had never stood a chance, that they, in their poverty and desperation, had been deliberately led into treason for the sole purpose of being caught? As he paced up and down the dingy 30-foot corridor outside his tiny cell in Dorchester jail, the only exercise he'd be permitted for the next 2 years, did Wedderburn realize just how close he had come to joining them? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Are you, Miss Abby, you coordinating? Are we getting, okay.
We are getting some questions. But
Great.
do you want to start?
I have a question. The fascinating is just this, the detail, and you know, you're just discovering the racial complexity of British society at this time, which surprises, I'm sure, most people. Wedderburn described himself as a Creole, and a Creole, of course, was a person initially born of European descent, right? Born in the New World, right? When did, what did he mean? Did he mean mulatto in that description of being a Creole? And when did that meaning change?
Yeah, good question. So as you can sort of tell, Robert Wedderburn was sort of fairly light-skinned when he came to Britain. Well, was always fairly light-skinned, but the use of the word Creole to describe people who were not white became more common in the early 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century, as it became much more common for mixed race children of planters to be sent over to England for their education. Amanda Goodrich has actually produced a fantastic biography of, let me see if I can get that picture back, of Henry Redhead York, who I pictured here. There he is, of Henry Redhead York, who I pictured here. And he always described himself as a Creole, and would occasionally sort of pass for white in British society. People would sometimes kind of note that he was from the West Indies. Sometimes people would kind of describe him as a mulatto or describe him as, you know, as being black in some way. But it was by no means kind of widely known, basically, that that his mother was an enslaved African woman. So yeah, that language basically changed in some ways as a function of a shifting demography of Creoles in Britain, and that it became much more.
Do we have any idea of how many mixed race children from the islands were sent to England for education?
I know that Daniel Livesey's book is very good on this. I think it's in the low hundreds over the span of, you know, 1750 to sort of 1833, 1834. What I think is really interesting, and this is a discussion that I would maybe have at just another time, is that we see actually a dip in the Black population in Britain after the end of colonial slavery there after the abolition of slavery, which suggests that slavery was one kind of important means of migration actually into Britain. And they're not all, privileged people. Wedderburn certainly wasn't privileged, didn't get anything, right, from his father, but did kind of have a sort of blood connection to Scotland, or that I hesitate to call it a kinship connection, because clearly they didn't feel any sense of kinship towards each either in either direction, I don't think. But that must have factored in Robert's decision to come to Britain, is that he had blood relatives there, and been closely linked to the guarantee of freedom.
And how did Henry York sustain himself?
He was very well off. He did inherit some of his father's money. He's a fascinating individual in his own right, Henry Redhead York. So he's becomes one of the more radical voices of the 1790s, and blends kind of anti-slavery politics with his domestic radicalism. He goes to France and is a close contact with the Girondins there. But then when he comes back to Britain, he recants that and becomes a kind of super conservative, like country gentleman, country Whig gentleman, who he then edits an ultra loyalist newspaper. I think it's the True Briton or something like that, which is, the title suggests, is sort of about opposing these Jacobins and radicals like Robert Wedderburn. So ideologically, as well as personally, like the Black British population, the Black population of Britain, is extraordinarily diverse and actually get into all different political groups, often within the space of a single generation.
And they, I presume, married English women, and just their children merged into the broader British population.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's why we see this demographic dip once we start getting the censuses being taken every 10 years. First of all, the censuses don't record race. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's no consistent way to record race anyway, as we've just seen, right? Creole or mulatto or African or Negro or whatever. People aren't quite sure a lot of the time. So it's quite a difficult job to kind of reconstruct what Britain's Black population looked like. We know it existed, and the relationships that like all immigrant groups, the African diaspora in Britain skewed heavily male, and that's partly to do with the prominence of military service as a way for Black people to come to Britain. The Black Loyalists after the American Revolution is a well-known wave, and so they married white women predominantly. And so you get essentially a kind of a progressively less visible Black population.
With his wife, was she upper class?
York's. Yes, well, I get sort of country gentry, that sort of level. So not kind of high-born aristocracy, but sort of roughly equivalent kind of stock, I suppose, in the sense of being kind of at the lower end of the landed gentry. Wedderburn's wife was working class, completely working class. I think as we'll see tomorrow, his daughter's occupation was listed as artificial flower maker. So people who worked, right at the kind of bottom end of the economy, I suppose.
And the book you referred to about Lipsey?
Daniel Livesey's book is called Children of Uncertain Fortune. And it's a superb book. I really recommend it.
Lipsey.
Livesey with a V.
Okay, great. You want to ask a question?
I have some questions over here. Stephen Niven actually recommended that Livesey book to me, so he's aware of it already too. So thank you. That was fascinating. We have a few questions coming in. I just wanted to comment that I thought that you used the phrase visible illegitimacy at some point in the middle of your talk. And now as you're talking about the generations kind of passing into invisibility, that's just kind of, an interesting thing to think about. But one of our fellows, Susanna Ashton, who is in the Zoom audience right now, says, I'd love to hear a bit more about Wedderburn's ordination, which he did in order to shore up what we might call his bad faith religious credentials. And I had noted that too, when the phrasing you used was, he managed to get himself ordained as a Unitarian minister. And it also reminded me of a little what you were talking about, the Obeah, the women's religion, and how that played into it. But anyway, back to Susanna's question. Can you talk a little bit more about how he finagled that ordination and what he saw as the outcome of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Wedderburn's kind of religious position was always really complicated. So the first that we hear of him is sort of rejecting the idea of authority by of secular and kind of religious or earthly religious authority through the adoption of this Unitarian position. So in the Truth Self-Supported, where are we? In the Truth Self-Supported, I actually had to cut a bit for time from my discussion because this is a completely under-researched text by Wedderburn. We don't really talk about it as part of his corpus, really, when it's really significant and this sort of lays bare the kind of foundation of his worldview. He talks about his rejection of the idea of the Trinity. So Unitarianism is the idea that God's just one thing. The Trinity is the idea that God is sort of the 3 in 1 and the 1 in 3, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And of course, he rejects the idea that the Son has to be a part of the Father and the Father has to be part of the Son. I think that's partly personal, but also because he sees the hypocrisy of established kind of religious Trinitarians also kind of investing and supporting slavery, and he talks about that throughout his career. So Unitarianism seems to be a really attractive type of religious persuasion for radicals like Wedderburn, partly because I think it's relatively easy to get yourself ordained as a Unitarian minister. I like to think of it as like one of those internet churches, you know, where you can get yourself, anybody can get themselves ordained, but it sort of protects you from being done for having a meeting with too many people, because political meetings that are too large are extremely suspicious to the Home Office there. So you end up with people who are kind of radical deists who say that God does exist, but he can't really do anything. He doesn't intervene right with people. And rarely you also get atheists, which Wedderburn skews more and more towards, it seems, the older he gets, getting themselves ordained, in bad faith, I suppose. As Unitarians to be sort of protected. But in Wedderburn's case, he early on really makes a strong case for Unitarianism on the basis partly of opposition to slavery. So, and sort of illegitimacy, if you like, of the established church. So it's complicated, but in my view, I think by the time he is in Dorchester jail, by the time we get to the end of what I've covered in today's lecture, Wedderburn sort of maybe around the sort of deist part. It's maybe God does exist, but he, what's he done for me lately?
Here's a question from May Samwanyambe, who seems to know a bit about Wedderburn, or James Wedderburn, and she says, I read that James Wedderburn had another illegitimate child after he returned to Scotland called Lydia, who married a butcher. Is this true in your understanding? And if so, this is an interesting question, linking your two lectures. And if so, how was she treated differently to Robert in terms of illegitimacy or legitimacy?
Yeah, good question. Hi, May. I know.
Oh, okay.
Hello, May. It's a good question. I know that one of Robert's daughters was called Lydia. So it would certainly make sense that there's a family name there. We also we know that James Wedderburn had many illegitimate children. Robert seems to think that there are a number of mixed race children growing up in Inveresque Lodge by the time he gets there, and it's part of the reason that he's so frustrated that his father is so unwilling to do anything to help him. So I think that this would be, potentially an example of, when we think about the Black population in 18th, 19th century Britain, we might just sort of assume that people will be poor because of the influence of slavery and because of the way race works. But in some instances, not common, but in some instances, we see relatively well-off mixed race illegitimate children. Dido Elizabeth Bell, of course, would be the famous example of somebody who grows up within a very privileged background, but is sort of part of the family, but at one remove, right? But held slightly differently, held slightly apart from the family. So it's a complicated sort of response because it's all bound up in that idea of legitimacy as the basis for full kind of inclusion within a family, for inheritance and so on. But illegitimate children are sort of grow up and have the emotional connections perhaps with other members, with the white members of the family, the legitimate members of the family, but are not always kind of fully welcomed, I suppose, into the quasi-legal structures that help to define the family.
Thank you. So you seem to know May, and she had another question, a specific question. She wants to know if it's possible to confirm the exact date and year that Robert Wedderburn went to visit his father at Inverest House.
1786, I think.
Okay.
I don't know when in 1786, so I know that Robert Wedderburn says stuff like it was about 21 or 22 years ago in 18.
Okay.
Whenever it was, 1824. That was when he met Colville. And also Wedderburn will then say, oh, it was about 5 to 10 years after I arrived in Britain. So we could sort of narrow it down. I think the number I arrived at was 1786. But yeah, I'm very happy to kind of do a bit more sitting down and kind of trying to, narrow it down from either end.
That actually leads pretty well to another question from Susanna Ashton, who I mentioned, who she's one of our fellows and she's a great archival digger, I'll say. And so she, not surprisingly, says, I would also love to more about the archival digging that is the substructure for this project. Which documents were right in front of you, but you had to see them differently to unpack this, and which kinds of documents were harder to imagine and locate? Where did you find surprises that added dimensions to this study, which you wouldn't have predicted?
Oh, great question. This is a good opportunity, actually, for me to pay respect to Ian McCalman's work, whose archival scholarship is phenomenal. We'll have a look tomorrow. I'll see if I can dig the picture out for tomorrow and put it in the PowerPoint. There's a little fact, a biographical fact about Robert Wedderburn, that he went to prison for a very short, like a few months, for minor kind of petty theft in 1813. And McCalman then duly kind of cites that. That's where I found that out, was McCalman said it. And I had a look in the footnotes. And then when I started this project, I went and chased down all of McCalman's references, because there are hundreds of them. And I thought, well, he just kind of mentions stuff and moves on. It's amazing. It doesn't really, I felt like I could, maybe do more with what he found, because I've got a bit more room here, right? So to speak. I found this item 788 out of about 812 in an unordered box. And somebody at the Home Office has scribbled two or three words on the back of an envelope, which talks about, Wedderburn convicted 1813, barely legible. It took me hours to find it. I was like, where's he? He must have written it down wrong or something. And it is an unbelievable feat of archival scholarship that he found that out and managed to and that is really important, that, because it pins a date to, and a kind of, it means that we can say, well, he was definitely in London, he was definitely still quite poor, all of these types of things. So Ian McCalman's scholarship is from the 1986 or something, was astonishing, and that was sort of my starting point. His book is about the radical underworld, so it deals with a lot of the Home Office reports and some of the spy reports as well. I'm happy to report I have managed, while I was sort of searching for some of the ones that McCalman did cite, I managed to pick up a couple that he missed, like the Wesleyan Methodist report. I think McCalman missed. Apologies, Ian McCalman, if you watch this and I found that. But I couldn't find that. So trawling through boxes and boxes and boxes of Home Office spy reports is a starting point. The other thing about Robert Wedderburn is that he's extremely poor and he's always getting into trouble, which means that he leaves us an unusually rich archival trail, right? Because he's constantly getting in contact with the bureaucracy of this punitive state, just for being poor, but also for being naughty. And he's therefore kind of a great kind of subject to search through the archives for, and particularly the new digitized records have made it possible to find interesting things in genealogy websites and things like that. Stuff that you just wouldn't be able to find it. You wouldn't have. It would be prohibitively long-winded to find it. Now we know that's not perfect, and we've seen that Robert Wedderburn can be spelled about 15 different ways: Wedderborn, Weatherborn, whatever. But that combined with kind of standing on the shoulders of previous scholars has been my kind of research methodology, if you like, for this project.
Sure, Susanna would have follow-up questions, but she
I'm
doesn't
sure,
have
I'm
any.
sure,
Yes,
yeah.
Wendell. Oh, thank you.
Yes, this is really fascinating. I'm just wondering if you've come across any evidence at all that Wedderburn's trajectory would have been any different if he had gotten a significantly different response from his father on that trip.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of interpretation, I suppose, isn't it? I do know that Wedderburn talks quite a lot about sons that don't get their inheritance and fathers that don't do what they should. So I feel like his political outlook is possibly influenced quite heavily by that experience of being defined as illegitimate, which is why I wanted to call this lecture Illegitimacy, and that disappointment of expectations, dispossession, I think, was really essential to his political outlook. In a more practical sense, he probably wouldn't have ever encountered the Spencian philanthropists if he was well off. They are self-consciously unrespectable, and they have these arguments and debates in pubs where they stand up on the table and spill their beer everywhere, and talk about murdering the Prince Regent or whatever it is. And the thing about that is that it's not just politically radical. To wealthy middle-class people, it's terribly tasteless and undignified, right? So his entire kind of way of existing and way of socializing, his way of being in the world is partly defined by his material circumstances. So I think it would have been a very, very different story indeed, as I suppose is suggested by what Henry Redhead York ended up doing, which was becoming this super conservative loyalist at the end, despite having, in some ways, a comparable kind of origin. Yeah, I think that it was essential to Wedderburn's identity and his politics, the experience of being illegitimate.
Thank you so much. This is so, it's just amazing. And thank you also for Susanna's question and for talking about the methodology, because there's so much, I think, anthropology, which is what I do. There's so much that we can really learn from that archival work. So I'm interested in, well, all of it, but you brought up at the very end of the talk, you talked about how the group had been infiltrated. Could you talk a little bit more about who that was? And to what, because I'm thinking about during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, surveilling Black movements in the United States is huge. Yeah. And so an infiltration of these groups and sort of the setup of these groups to fail in order to be killed, I guess, or I guess assassinated. Can you tell us about who this person was? Are they also people that are considered Creole? Are they white, people? How do they sort of get into these groups? And is there a trail that we can follow?
Yeah. So yeah, I included this as is a kind of a caricature, which is designed to kind of draw attention to how sort of evil it was that Edwards, the spy, as he was called, infiltrated this group and deliberately, kept sort of spurring them on to be more and more treasonous and more desperate, you know, in the way that they acted. The spies and the informants that we're looking at here, some of them are like volunteers. Some of them see what they think is this really dangerous group. And I suppose in 1819, Britain is closer to a popular revolution, to like a French Revolution or even a Haitian Revolution, than it ever was before. You know, and has been ever since, I think. In 1820, the Cato Street conspiracy that William Davidson was a member of had a pretty well-developed plan. If you go into the National Archives, I took a picture and then somebody came over and told me I had to delete it because they got a recipe for a hand grenade. And it's like, you know, 2 quarts sheet tallow and, you know, gunpowder or whatever. And I wasn't allowed to take it out actually because I would have been in contravention of a terrorist act, because you shouldn't know how to make explosives. But so I mean, it was an extremely well-developed plan. And also in there, you see their ciphers, which is like little squares of paper cut out and an alphabet, so they could speak in code and stuff like that. What I would say is that these groups themselves formed out of really acute financial distress and desperation and having just no other option. I think we need to be extremely sympathetic towards people who are insurrectionists in early 19th century, working class insurrectionists in early 19th century Britain. William Davidson, so I wrote an article about William Davidson before. One of his last bits of evidence that he leaves in the archive, in the trail there, is a pawnbroker's ticket. So he goes to a society that's designed to help people who are, destitute and starving on the streets. They give him this ticket. He takes it to the pawnbroker and exchanges it for a gun, because that's, he's decided this is it. This is what I'm going to do now. So instead of kind of taking it and, exchanging this ticket, the money that he's got for food, he goes and says, right, I'm going to get this rusty old blunderbuss. Probably wouldn't have fired if he got the chance. That just because he's so extremely kind of desperate. So I think that people like Edwards, the instigator, Edwards the spy, were word I'm looking for, predators. I think that they were predatory in a way. I'm sure that they thought that they were doing the right thing, but particularly in this instance, the consistency with which they keep riling people up and keep trying to push them and give them money. It's, don't worry, I've got someone who's got us some money. We can use this to buy weapons. That's Davidson's job. He'll go out and get old bits of iron and then sharpen them into stakes and pikes, and he'll go and get us guns and stuff. And that money's coming from the Home Office. So it's quite analogous to what happened with black radical groups in the 20th century with the FBI. So I think that there's a number of kind of resonances there. But the Cato Street conspiracy, I don't think we would classify it as a kind of a black radical group, but certainly a part of a kind of broader insurrectionary tradition.
That actually leads well to, and new questions always come in right towards the end. Here's a question I think led to by what you were just talking about. One of our Zoom attendees asks, what was the fate of acts laid to the root after Wedderburn was no longer editing or writing? Or did other journals rise to speak to the poorer, lower class reader of this journal?
Yes, indeed. Well, there was never anything quite like acts laid to the root. So I wanted to spend more time on the acts laid to the root, but again, Wedderburn did so much. Acts laid to the root went on for 6 issues. It ends in the middle of a sentence. As you know, all the best kind of periodicals do. There were dozens of little penny periodicals for ultra radicals to spread this type of politics, but there was nothing quite like the acts laid to the root that really centralized the enslaved. So lots of radical periodicals talk about slavery, and usually what they say is like, oh, us white working class people are just as oppressed as the African slaves in the West Indies. And sometimes they use that to say, well, we should all be working together to overthrow the elites. And sometimes they say, well, we should stop paying so much attention to the plight of these people, Africans so far away when there's English people. Charity ought to begin at home. That type of argument is common. But none of those really put enslaved people at the center of this revolution, quite like Wedderburn did. I think he's really unique in the British radical movement of this time.
It's really interesting. Yeah, that centering of that experience is fascinating.
And you would sometimes see in radical papers, you would sometimes see in radical papers sympathetic accounts of uprisings in the West Indies and saying, the enslaved are taking their freedom, why don't we do the same thing? But again, it's usually there's usually a little bit of a sting in the tail saying, like, don't Englishmen deserve something more than the Africans do?
That's what I'm thinking. I think it's been a long time, but I think Mayhew later obviously did that, where the comparison of enslaved peoples to the British working class, but it was always centering the British working class and using the slave experience as a metaphorical one rather than looking at what was actually happening.
Sorry. So
go ahead, please.
Really interesting is that Wedderburn is operating in a young, but I think identifiable tradition of Black British radicalism that somebody like Ottobah Kagwano was kind of holding the torch for a generation earlier. There's also, I suppose Equiano, we talk about in terms of British radicalism in this period. I think Equiano is obviously much more respectable than somebody like Wedderburn, and probably more so than Ottobah Kagwano as well. But I think that actually the contribution of Black radicalism to British politics is the centering of colonial contexts, not as a metaphor for what the English are going through, but as part of like an essential component of the problem. And that identification is, I think, a contribution of Black British radicalism specifically.
But Equiano had a lot more money than all the others, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, he was quite successful because of the sale of his book.
Yeah. And I think that it's part of the secret to his success was that he could get the moderates on board, and he could kind of take advantage of the way that the national conversation, I suppose, was going around slavery. Is that he didn't sort of spook the kind of moderate white readership. Whereas I think Wedderburn maybe would have frightened quite a lot of people. It's too radical, right? The idea, because people were terrified of an insurrection endangering the whites in the West Indies.
But he couldn't have been surprised that he was arrested, Wedderburn.
No, I can't. He must have known that it was coming, because they knew that spies were in the audience. So I mean, he always said in his defense for seditious blasphemy that he extemporized his speeches on the spot. He didn't read them, prepare them in advance, and he would just come up with them on off the top of his head, which sort of scans when you look at the spies reports of them. They're quite sort of meandering. But yeah, he never denied saying this stuff during his trial. He said, well, you should be more lenient on me because I'm enslaved and I grew up without the benefit of education. But he never tried to say that he didn't say this stuff or didn't think he did.
Abby, can I ask the final question before we take this back?
Of course you can, Professor Gates.
How would you characterize the state of Black British studies, as it were? Many of us associate, when we think of the studies of Black Britain, we of course think of the golden age, the Renaissance, Black British cultural studies, right?
Yeah.
Under Stuart, et cetera, et cetera. And then we think of the developments in art, Isaac Julian, Kobe Mercer, et cetera, et cetera. How does those kind of studies, and Hazel Harvey, of course, relate to the more granular kind of study that you're doing, the recovery, digging, excavating all these Afro-British people and canonizing, and which is dear to my heart, which is one reason I wanted to invite you here.
I think we're in a new kind of golden age of Black British studies. I think Black British history is really right at the center of what's happening in British history more generally. I think it was in the wind since I guess 2015, 2016, partly with the Brexit vote, which prompted this reevaluation of a national relationship to empire. And then after the killing of George Floyd, that kind of global Black Lives Matter movement really supercharged it. And in the past 3 years, I think I've seen 15 to 20 permanent academic posts in Black British history being advertised. Now that is, we have to be sure, that is in response to a scandalous underrepresentation of Black historians in UK academia. I think back in 2016, there was one female Black professor of history in the UK. So in terms of the broader kind of political impetus for that shift in focus towards Black British studies, there's a very, very good reason why it's now being treated as a priority, because it is scandalously underdone. But the good news is that there's incredible work being done about Black people in Europe and Black people in Britain. Olivet Otelli is doing fantastic stuff. We've got Malaysia Ono George, Kenetta Hammond Perry, Rob Waters' book's fantastic. There's loads of new scholarship coming out. And yeah, I think that the conversation, I suppose the big difference is now not just a recognition that Black intellectuals and Black political activists were present and important, but actually an understanding that they're central, that there is no British history without Black history. And that, I think, is a new way of thinking about British history, that people who haven't ever even studied it, who are surprised to hear there are Black people in Britain before 1945,
right?
Before, people who are surprised to hear that are now saying, well, actually, I think I need to engage with these Black intellectuals to get a sense of British history. And that, I think, is something to be optimistic about, even if we've got massive amounts of work still to do.
Of course. Great. Thank you so much for a riveting lecture.